So this is the old radiator. You can see where all the mineral deposits have been leaking down on it. And that's the first clue. And then when I went to pull the upper radiator hose off of the neck of the radiator, and I was kind of pulling on the hose, wiggling it, trying to get it loose, I actually sheared the whole neck of the upper radiator hose completely off. So that was literally one big bump away from shearing, going down the road, and having a really bad day. I've already got the radiator out. That's pretty straightforward if you've ever worked on a car before. Wasn't anything too surprising. There's a couple of Torx bolts that hold on the top corners that hold the radiator and the condenser together, but other than that, like I said, wasn't really anything too surprising. I got my wiper cowl and pollen filter, air housing, whatever you want to call it, off. I'm going to leave these intact where they're at. Just kind of work them around, whichever direction I need to move them. I pulled a temp sensor here, and then I guess a cam sensor down here. Pulled the connector off to get this harness loose and slacked up, and then we'll get to work on doing valve cover and the oil filter housing. Gasket. So this thing's got a pretty good little waterfall of oil leaks underneath it, or down the front of it here. There we go. You can see how wet the front of this is. So we're going to tackle the known oil leaks up top, and then we're going to clean underneath it. So it's got quite a bit of leaking happening down here as well. And so sway bar is wet, steering rack's wet, some of the power steering lines are wet, and it goes back to the back of the oil pan is also wet back here. We're going to hose all that down with brake clean and get a fresh start. So anytime you're diagnosing oil leaks, you kind of have to start top down, within reason. Obviously you wouldn't want to do valve covers and then immediately do head gaskets right after that, because then you're doing twice the work. But in this case, valve covers and oil filter housing gasket are fairly easy to get to, so we're going to do those first and clean off the bottom side, and then see if there's any other reoccurring leaks that we need to address. So let's get to it. Just about got it ready to come out, so got all my coils unplugged. Well, except for the back one, I couldn't get the connector off of it, so I just pulled the coil with it. But other than that, got my harness set back. I'm using my bungee cord to hold it up and out of the way. Got my fuel rail unplugged. Those just kind of pop up. A little forceful to get them up, but they're just a little spring, kind of like this. But they're actually here, but they're just a little spring connector that holds some tension on them. And then we're ready to pull the valve cover off, so we'll get some bolts going and see what kind of trouble we can get into. Well, did all that work to work around it. Now it looks like the strut tower brace is going to need to come out. Finally got it in a position that I can actually get it out. Oh. Well, there's the top of the head. We'll clean up some of the mating surface a little bit, just rub them down with a rag. So I ended up having to lift my electric box cover so I could get my harnesses loose here and out of the way, and that was just barely enough to get us out. Here's the valve cover side. You can see I dripped a bunch of oil whenever I rolled this thing over, and in fact it's still dripping oil. So I believe that's probably this front camshaft actuator, that seal, it's also leaking, so I'll need to get one of those coming. And then the valve cover gasket itself just kind of sits in the valley like that, and you can tell it's actually in okay shape. It's not terrible, but when they get really old, they get really brittle, and they see, you can hear this. So when they get old and dry, you can see how it's holding its shape. I'll compare that to the new one, but the new one will be just soft and falling over. So anyways, we'll get this cleaned up and go back together with it. Like I showed you earlier on the valve cover, you can see this is nice and pliable and soft, and this one will be much more rigid and dry, if I could even get it out. There we go. Once you get it started, it usually comes out pretty fairly easily. So you can pretty easily tell the difference between these two. So this one's side by side there. I mean, you can see how loose and soft this side is and how firm and tight this side is. So what ends up happening is when you have the clamping force between the two mating surfaces, if it's a softer rubber, you actually get tension pushing back on the mating surfaces and actually seals tightly, right? And then once you have a compressed and dried, then there's going to be some little small imperfections, and I'm exaggerating with my hands, but there's going to be some small little imperfections where oil is going to push past, and if that gasket's not nice and loose and pliable in there, then it doesn't actually stay sealed. So this should be and this is even after cleaning. You can see how much oil traces we have here. It's after spraying it down with the brake clean. So it's pretty evident that this is where our main leak up top was. Been leaking for quite some time. So we'll get this thing back together and on to putting the valve cover back in. I did want to show you one more trick over here. So this is one of those tricks that may save you in a pinch, or in this case, make you a lot of money. So the that positioned in here somewhere. All right, so the back bolt back here is underneath the intake, and it's kind of difficult to get to. And I'm going to show you a little trick here. So these are E10s, which is reverse Torx, right? So these are reverse Torx. That is the correct size. Now it's also the same size as a metric 8 and a 12 point. You can use the same. Now if you're getting into crazy tight Torx, don't do this, but for most of this type of E10s, you can use a metric wrench on them and they'll be just fine. So in this case, where I saved a bunch of time and made some money here, let me get my 2 bolts started that are out here and easy to get to, so it's holding it in place. Now this one's a little tight to get into, and actually this one I used the metric 8 on as well because of the coolant neck coming off the front of it that was a little tight to get in there, and makes it Makes it where I don't have to get the whole entire socket in that spot. Oh. So I'm going to get it run down where we're near where we need to be, but still give me enough wiggle room where we can make a small adjustment so we can get that last one started. So it's another tip: don't ever tighten down any hardware until you have all the hardware started, because you can have some small alignment issues. So on this guy, I went in and reached in through the intake between the runners, and I used a finger like that and was able to run it down. So I'm using two fingers kind of like that to run the bolt. Kind of push and pull at the same, or push and push two different directions at the same time. And then once I'm confident I've got it started, and then I'm going to run it down as far as I can, because this is actually going pretty smoothly. I also did some of this earlier too, where I was reaching around and pinching the whole thing, but pretty close to being where I want to be. So I actually went in this way. And so once the wrench is on there, you're just reaching through the hole. Obviously this isn't the most fun thing in the world to do, because there's kind of weird access points and you can't really get a good shot at it of pushing for torque purposes, but sure beats the heck out of pulling the whole intake completely off and having to deal with all the connectors and sealing it back up. The fewer things that you can disconnect when you're doing a job, the less likely you are to screw something up because you forgot to connect it back up, or you had a gasket that got rolled underneath itself, or something goofy happened. Plus, in this case, on an older car, I'm saving the possibility of needing to replace intake gaskets as well. So customer saves money and I save time, and it means we both win in the end. So like I said, this is a little trick like that, and this I think paid something like, I'd have to go back and look it up, somewhere around 2 hours to do that. And it's I already had drained the coolant because I was doing the radiator, already had the fans out because I'm doing the radiator, and this one's easy to get to, this one's easy to get to. That one, probably on paper, the instructions would tell you to pull the whole intake off, but saving all that means we're saving time and making money at the same time. So. Alright, so I'll pull off the old valve cover gasket. Pull off our rings. And again, comparison, you can see how much more soft and supple the old one, the new one is compared to the old one. So yeah, it was time to get these done. They're old and dry. Now these are actually directional, as I just found out. Kind of fatter on one side. Now with these rope style gaskets, they can easily fall out. So you have to really pay attention when you're putting it in, because it's so easy for one of these to fall off, and you won't necessarily notice it if it's in a weird spot and you got to bolt this thing down, and then you've just created a new leak because the valve cover gasket's not where it's supposed to be, and then you have a gaping hole. So what I like to do once I get the valve cover in the spot where it goes, I like to kind of move it around a little bit and make sure it feels like it's seated, and then I'll take a mirror and go all the way around the edges and make sure I can see the gasket all the way around and it's not rolled outside or rolled inside. So that's something to look for. The other thing you can do is lubricate your mating surfaces with a little bit of silicone spray or oil or something like that. I also went and picked up a new intake motor or intake camshaft motor gasket for that guy, and we got the front 2/3 of my bolts started, and then I'm gonna get the back ones started, and then we'll go back through and tighten everything up, get rid of the watch for clearance reasons, and here we go. Pretty close. All right, so I'm gonna put my intake motor back on, or cam motor back on, and swap for a new glove that isn't shredded. And this back vacuum line back here, which I presume runs over to the booster. It's quite difficult to get off. So we're gonna give it a little love with some little bit of lube ahead of time, and hopefully that'll make it nicer to come off in the future for whatever poor bastard works on this next. And these were E8s, so I'm gonna go back in it. I'm gonna put my top bolts in and get them not tight, but starting to snug down so I can hold a little bit of pressure forward on the motor, because right now it does not line up at all. So I'm just going to walk it back and forth. Do something like one turn on each side. Not really counting, just approximating. Okay, I got the front one snug, but not tight. So we'll get our bottom bolt started. And the gasket was held on by these larger Torx screws. Come on. intake motor's put on, ready for ignition coils, and getting this harness situated again, and both coil grounds need to go on. Making good progress. Well, these coil connectors are pretty sweet little design. They kind of lift up, and then when they lift up, they eject the wire out of them. So I get in there and really let you see that. When you lift up on it, it ejects the wire out. So it's pretty slick little design. You have to sometimes kind of have to back force it to make sure it plugs back in correctly. But I have my coils and stuff back on. Got my harness right out of the way it was. Got my fuel rail pushed back down, and you just kind of press it down on the top of each one of those, where those connectors go down into the injectors. I'm not going to worry about any of this top stuff because I want to get my radiator put back in. And once I get my radiator and fan put in, fill it up with coolant, then I can go ahead and run the car while the car's running, making sure I don't have any coolant leaks or oil leaks. I can go and put the rest of the stuff back on top, and then the stuff underneath, the bottom shield underneath. Again, we're trying to make time, we're trying to do this as quickly as possible and make money, and anytime I can multitask, the better. So if I were to put this all the way back together, even if I didn't have any issues, I put this all the way back together, and then I run the car, then I have to sit here and watch it run. I might as well be working while it's running. So the goal right now is to get this thing as far as we can to get it to run, and then we'll worry about getting the rest of it tidied back up. Well, I got my radiator and my fans back in. We're in good shape there. Got my harness plugged back in for the fans. I need to set my airbox in here, and then we're ready to do a test fire on this guy. So we're going to do that real quick, and then we're going to put some coolant in it, and then we'll actually start it up. This thing had a coolant leak, and I got out about 5 quarts of, maybe a little bit more than 5 quarts out, so we should be getting pretty close once we get a full gallon in this thing. Just doing a lot of burping in there. Making all kinds of fun noises. Alright, so we got at least enough in there to fill the bottle up. We still need to do some burping and bleeding. It's the other benefit of having the car up in the air, at least the front end, is the higher you get your reservoir in relation to your heater core, the better you're going to have on bleeding this thing out. Because if your heater core sits higher than, or at the same height as your reservoir, then you're more likely to get air trapped at the top of the core. But if you can get the car to lean uphill, you can get a little bit better bleeding procedure going on it. And then we'll cycle over to heat. That'll also help with our bleeding procedure. Don't necessarily need full volume. That'll help. Temperature will help verify that we actually have heat in the car. We got nice bleeding going on in here. See the coolant flow there. We need to add a little bit more water. Okay, we'll let it run for a few minutes. We'll make sure we got heat inside the car. Well, BMW is basically back together. I got to put the bottom under shield back on it, which I want to hose down and clean it off before I do that because it's pretty gross. But anyways, it's all back together and ready to send it on home. I got to do a quick test drive in the morning and then double check my coolant level, and it's time to get paid. So appreciate y'all checking out another video of mine, and if you like this type of content, feel free to subscribe, and I will catch y'all on the next one.